Hello and welcome to the show at our new time. I'm Anand Naidu, sitting in for Riz Khan. Many weapons have emerged over the past decade to combat global warming, but perhaps none is more controversial than the idea of carbon trading, where polluting nations can buy credits from each other and from poor countries, basically to continue polluting. The idea was supposed to be simple: stick a price on carbon so that individuals, companies and governments could trade it like stocks and bonds. Polluting nations can buy offsets from nations that don't pollute as much, allowing the richer companies and governments to continue polluting. On the other hand, companies and governments in industrial countries now have a financial incentive to pollute less. So today we ask, is carbon trading a false solution to the problem of climate change? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or email, and of course we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me today is Daphne Weisham, the founder of the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network and board member of the Institute for Policy Studies here in Washington. She is also the co-host of Earthbeat Radio, which airs on 54 stations in the United States and Canada. Dr. Joseph Romm is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and editor of Climate Progress, a website that focuses on climate science, solutions and politics. His upcoming book is Straight Up: America's Fiercest Climate Blogger Takes on the Status Quo Media, Politicians and Clean Energy Solutions. And from London, Patrick Birley, the chief executive of the European Climate Exchange, the world's biggest exchange for companies, banks and hedge funds to trade permits to emit carbon dioxide. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Daphne, let's start with you. Cap and trade is a regulatory system whereby a government sets limits on the polluting emissions, if I could put it that way. That's the cap. And then, of course, it allows utilities and manufacturers to trade pollution credits or allowances. Mm-hmm. In your view, is that the best way to combat climate change and global warming?
No, and it's not just in my view. I mean, I think if you look at the evidence, pre-Kyoto, we had roughly an increase of 1.5% in greenhouse gas emissions. Post-Kyoto Protocol of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, we've seen an increase of roughly 3% overall. So clearly emissions are going up despite the trading of pollution. We've seen in the EU emissions trading scheme, emissions have gone up, profits have gone up for coal-fired power producers, the nuclear power industry, and unfortunately prices have also gone up for average people. They're seeing their utility bills increasing. So unfortunately we're continuing with this scheme in all the approaches that are being considered thus far in the US Senate. They involve cap and trade in some form or another. And what we're saying is, you know, when you crash test a car and it crashes, you don't go at a much higher speed and do the same thing again. That we should really be thinking about why this particular model is failing.
Well, let's go to Patrick Birley in London. He is the chief executive there of the European Climate Exchange, where the system has been operating for some time. Now, we just heard Daphne Weisham tell us here that there's been more pollution since the system has been implemented. What has been the European experience?
Well, it's absolutely not the experience here in Europe. I mean, in Europe, the system which has been going, just standing back, Europe is the only place in the world that have actually gone ahead with putting in place mandatory caps on the amount of carbon that can be pumped into the atmosphere on a national level. So all 27 European member states have committed to the same system of capping and then allowing trading. And really we have to emphasize always that although there's a lot of emphasis on trading of carbon, the system is really all about the caps. It's all about setting a limit on the amount of carbon that can be pumped into the atmosphere and slowly over time reducing the limit over time. As a result of that, companies who are able to cut their emissions quicker than the trajectory that's been set between the scientists and the politicians, they are incentivized and able to sell their additional credits to those companies who are not reducing at the required pace. But as long as the overall reduction of all companies added together throughout the system is effective, then the target of reductions will be met through the system. And the European example, which started under the Kyoto Protocol at the beginning of 2008 and runs through until 2012, is and will continue to hit the targets which were set at that time, which in the European case is an 8% reduction in the amount of carbon being pumped into the atmosphere by 2012, and that's an 8% reduction from the 1990 levels. So the system in Europe absolutely is working, and it's an example which should be followed by others in the world.
Okay, Dr. Romm, which side of the divide do you fall on?
Well, the irony is that the system of trading was developed in the United States during the Clean Air Act of President George Bush's father. I think it's a pretty good system. You know, there is no perfect system. Ultimately, everyone wants to reduce pollution. There are only a few options for doing so. Either you're going to put in a shrinking cap that government regulates and create a rising price, or you're going to put in some sort of government regulations that tell industries what they have to do. The thinking was that if you create a market-based mechanism, that the free enterprise system will figure out the most cost-effective way to do it. Either approach has its weaknesses and its strengths. But I think by and large the European trading system has worked pretty well. They've achieved the reduction. They're on track to reach the reductions that they have said that they wanted to achieve. Most of those reductions, virtually all of them, are going to be reduced by domestic reductions in Europe rather than through the purchase of offsets. I'm not the biggest fan of these so-called offsets. I think we have such a big global warming problem. The planet is heating up. Last decade was the hottest decade on record. We're seeing droughts and wildfires and extreme
weather. I want to ask you about that. Cap and trade works on the assumption that the science says that global warming is caused by these emissions.
Sure.
Is that now indisputable?
I think that it is indisputable. I mean, if you go straight by the science. I mean, I think that scientists haven't done a good job of explaining this, because scientists spend a lot of time. Scientists become famous working at sort of the fringes of science, but the basics are very straightforward. Because of greenhouse gases, the natural greenhouse effect, this planet is habitable. We're 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer because of greenhouse gases. But now humans are pouring billions and billions of tons of extra heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And I don't think that you would find any serious climate scientists that would dispute that more greenhouse gases trap heat. And on our current emissions path, if we kept doing nothing, we would just radically change the climate.
I wanted to just return to something that Joe Romm raised, namely the issue of carbon offsets. Some people have coined the term rip offsets to describe just exactly what's going on with carbon offsets. And one of the reasons they're considered rip offsets is because they're virtually impossible to verify. The U.S. Government Accounting Office has actually said they're impossible to verify, and yet in the U.S. House and Senate bills that were moving forward, we had 2 billion tons of carbon offsets, which would have meant the U.S. could have done absolutely nothing that was verifiable until roughly 2030. And they could have counted it as an emissions reduction. So they could have said all those dams that China is building, all those maybe waste to energy facilities in India, we're going to count those as clean energy, and the credits will count towards our goals. Now, when the gentleman who's speaking on behalf of the European carbon market suggests that they've met their goals, I would say, you know, what share of that has come from carbon offsets? Because to me, they are the most problematic, the most corruptible, and they're one reason why the price of carbon is as low as it is today.
Okay, Patrick Birley, do you want to respond to that?
If I can answer it very clearly. Across Europe, one is allowed to use up to 12%, or an average of 12% across all of the European nations. Are able to be supported, your reductions are able to be supported by offsets from developing nations. And I have to say that, just going back to what Daphne was saying, you need to define what an offset is, because offset is being used as a very generic term. The offsets that we allow here in Europe are only offsets which have been approved and gone through the extremely difficult process of verification through the United Nations FCCC system, which is an extraordinarily difficult system. I agree with Daphne that there are definitely offset projects out there which don't have additional impact. There are definitely some rip-off artists in the marketplace, but those credits are not usable in the European scheme. So you have to look at the quality. You can't use offset as a generic term The credits that have been coming out of the UNFCCC are extremely difficult to achieve, and they have to prove that there are additional reductions in the developing countries that have been achieved as a result of their existence.
Can I just give one example of offsets that have been approved by the UN CDM board, the Clean Development Mechanism board? One involves gas flaring in the Niger Delta, which is totally illegal. It's against the law. It should have been phased out decades ago. However, we now have an oil company, Eni, an Italian oil company, that has succeeded in getting approval for ending gas flaring, which is illegal, and getting carbon credits for ending that gas flaring under the CDM. This
Daphne,
kind
you really
of activity
have to be careful though about talking.
This kind of activity will essentially mean that the EU can continue with business as usual, and corporations like Chevron and Exxon are being financially rewarded for doing the wrong thing, which sends exactly the wrong message to corporations.
So once they shut off the emissions, they got rewarded for it.
If they now, what we're doing is we're creating a perverse incentive to actually pollute more, because the corporations will get the message if they flagrantly violate the law, they will actually get paid for ending what is illegal.
Okay, Patrick, you want to say something?
Well, I have to say that again, I think that Daphne's, I'm sure that if you look at the hundreds of millions of credits which have been issued through this system, that you will eventually find one or two where there's been a problem. So we acknowledge the system is not perfect. But in terms of this issue of offsets, this is where NGOs such as Daphne's seem to be in exactly the same position as ExxonMobil and those polluters. The far right wing and the far left wing both seem to be saying that this system doesn't work, and perhaps the reality and the truth lies in the middle here, which is that the system, yes, it's not perfect, it's a brand new system which is being put in place, and a system that needs to exist for many years if it is to be effective. But again, offsets are only allowable for 12% on average of the reductions in Europe. 88% has to come through domestic action. And it is that 12% allows for a transfer of wealth and expertise to areas of the world which really can benefit from it and can provide genuine carbon reduction projects at a much cheaper price than can be achieved in Europe. And don't forget that a ton of carbon pumped into the atmosphere in Africa or in South America is exactly the same as a ton of carbon pumped into the atmosphere here in Europe or there in the States.
Dr. Romm, do you agree that up to 90% is what's done domestically?
Well, I should say that currently in the European trading system, I think only about 2 or 3% of the emissions reductions are being achieved through offsets, because it has been cheaper to reduce emissions domestically. I coined the term RIP offsets on my blog, climateprogress.org, principally for purely voluntary measures that were not verified at all. Look, the key thing is the industrialized countries needed to set up a mechanism whereby polluters could pay for poorer countries to develop cleanly. Everybody wants to do that. So you need an approach. This is the approach that they came up with. I agree that it's not perfect, and I would like to see more verification. But fundamentally, you want polluters in the rich countries to help the poorer countries use clean energy and reduce their pollution. So I think the key is to fix the mechanism and make it as verifiable as possible, rather than get rid of it entirely.
Okay, we are going to have to take a short break right now. More of our discussion in a moment. We'll be right back.